At 3:14 a.m., a brutal cold pressed over the Kupiansk valley like a steel weight. Frost clung to every branch, every trench, every forgotten helmet half buried in the mud. The night was dead, no wind, no distant artillery thunder, not even the usual crackle of radio chatter leaking through Russian lines. Only the glint of moonlight on metal hinted at the vast force lying in wait. Russia's $3.6 billion artillery line, reinforced over 7 months, stretched across 2.7 kilometers of ridgelines. MSTB howitzers sat in dug-in revetments. Towed Hyacinth guns were lined up with mathematical precision. Behind them, hulking Smerch and Uragan launchers loomed in silence, pointed toward Ukrainian-held terrain. 3 electronic warfare stations, Purol, Krasuka, and Zittel, formed a dome of interference so dense even a commercial drone couldn't enter the area without dropping from the sky like a stone. The Russians believed they were unbreachable. The valley felt like it had accepted this, still, suffocating, untouched. What no one in those trenches knew was that 30 kilometers away, in a forest of skeletal trees, Ukrainian engineers were performing the final checks on something unheard of. A machine-driven symphony. A mechanical swarm designed for one purpose, to tear the steel curtain apart in minutes. Tonight was not about artillery against artillery. Tonight was about numbers, algorithms, and the cold logic of technology. Ukraine wasn't just planning a strike, they were about to rewrite how wars begin. The operation didn't begin tonight. It began weeks earlier, when reconnaissance teams started building a digital skeleton of the Russian line. They mapped every gun position using a layered method. Thermal imaging at night. Fixed-wing scouts during the day. Signal intelligence operators detecting every radio ping. Ground recon teams crawling within 600 meters of Russian trenches. The result was the most accurate battlefield map Ukraine had drawn in months. But even with perfect coordinates, one problem remained. Russia's EW shield. The Krasuka and Zittel systems sitting behind the artillery were strong enough to distort drone GPS, scramble Ukrainian frequencies, and disable aerial strikes before they even approached. Ukraine couldn't simply send 10 drones. Or 20. Or 50. The Russians would swat them out of the air. So Ukrainian engineers, mathematicians, and drone pilots gathered in a repurposed warehouse and built something entirely new. A multi-layered swarm, each segment designed to defeat one layer of Russia's defense. Decoy drones to overload radar. Low-profile FPV drones to deliver the first real hits. Anti-radiation strike drones to blind the EW stations. Loitering munitions to finish the job. A total of 201 drones, launched in perfect sequence, synchronized through encrypted frequencies Russia could not jam. It wasn't just an attack plan. It was a web, wrapped around the artillery line long before the first drone even took flight. The launch began at 3:16 a.m. Not with a roar, but with a rising hum, soft, mechanical, unsettling. Then it deepened. 10 drones. Then 20. Then 100. Soon the forest clearing buzzed like a giant beehive ready to split open. The first wave, decoy drones, each fitted with reflector plates that made them look 10 times their real size on radar. Their purpose was psychological chaos, not destruction. If the Russians believed they were under air attack, they'd expose themselves trying to respond. The second wave, FPV kamikaze drones, launched low, hugging terrain so tightly that radar couldn't see them. The third wave, anti-radiation drones, gliding quietly behind the others. They didn't need guidance, they homed in on emitted signals like sharks tracking blood. The final wave stayed on the ground, loitering munitions, waiting for the command to take off. When the swarm finally lifted above the tree line, it resembled a floating constellation, lights blinking, propellers slicing the cold air. They moved in formation, guided by algorithms developed over months, tested over ruined villages, perfected over deadly trial and error. This was the largest coordinated drone operation Ukraine had launched since the war began. No humans at the front. No traditional artillery. Just machines, working in synchrony, flying toward a sleeping enemy. At 3:18 a.m., Russian radar operators first noticed the anomaly. One target. Then 5. Then dozens. Their screens flashed warnings, markers merging and multiplying until the displays resembled a storm cloud more than a tactical map. Targets at 1,600 meters, altitude inconsistent, possibly fixed wing, no, wait, multiple. The operator's voice broke into static as Ukrainian ECM units activated, jamming Russian channels. Floodlights snapped on across the ridgeline. Soldiers scrambled awake, dragging cables, trying to reposition artillery. The Russians attempted to track incoming objects manually, but the decoys kept duplicating signatures, tricking their sensors into hallucinating threats that didn't exist. The panic spread faster than orders. A lieutenant shouted to open fire, but no one knew which direction to aim. Radar-guided guns rotated helplessly between phantom coordinates. The EW stations tried to disrupt the swarm, but Ukraine's encrypted routing and frequency-hopping algorithms made their jammers useless. Then the floodlights, meant to illuminate the sky, did the opposite. They turned every Russian artillery position into a glowing bullseye. The FPV drones dove. The real attack had begun. The first FPV drones arrived just seconds after the Russian floodlights flared to life. Gliding at treetop height, they were nearly invisible, small black silhouettes slicing through the night air, propellers whispering like insects. Russian gunners squinted upward, searching for huge aircraft, unaware that the real threat had already slipped beneath their field of vision. At 3:20 a.m., the first strike hit. A Ukrainian FPV slammed directly into the barrel of a 152mm MSTB howitzer, detonating its explosive payload. The barrel bent like molten plastic, the blast tearing through the gun shield and shredding the crew sheltering behind it. A fireball rippled across the snow-covered trench. Seconds later, a second FPV struck an ammunition crate nearby, sending sparks and ember trails spiraling upward as the crate erupted into a chaotic fountain of burning propellant. Russian gunners shouted, trying to will remaining artillery into firing position, but chaos drowned their attempts. Multiple artillery crews ran toward their vehicles, pulling at tow cables, attempting to haul the guns into cover. It was pointless. The FPV drones were already circling overhead like hawks waiting for prey to move. A third blast erupted as an FPV drone dove into the cabin of a fuel transport truck. The explosion lit the entire ridge orange. Within seconds, the flames spread, reaching fuel lines, turning the truck into a 20-meter-tall inferno that cast dancing shadows across the trenches. Shards of metal rained down onto nearby artillery teams, forcing them to scatter blindly. Amid the rising smoke, Ukrainian operators watched from a remote bunker, guiding each drone with steady hands and ice-cold precision. Every strike was deliberate. The swarm had no wasted motion, no confusion. It was a perfect choreography of destruction. One artilleryman tried to man a Zu-23 anti-air gun, firing blindly into the air, but the FPV drones flew too low and too fast. Bullets cracked overhead, but none found a target. An FPV drone banked hard to the right, climbed for a split second, then dove straight into the anti-air platform. The gunner didn't even see it coming. In less than 3 minutes, Ukraine had knocked out multiple howitzers, torched a fuel depot, and eliminated anti-air support. Russia's artillery line, once a symbol of immovable power, was beginning to unravel. But the swarm wasn't finished. The operation wasn't even halfway done. For years, Russia relied on its electronic warfare systems as its invisible armor. Krasuka, Zittel, and Purol stations had disrupted GPS, blinded reconnaissance drones, and shut down Ukrainian guided munitions. These systems had saved Russian battalions before. Tonight, they were about to be erased. As the FPV units finished ripping apart frontline artillery, the anti-radiation drones closed in on their primary targets, the EW stations behind the ridge. These drones were designed differently. They didn't rely on GPS. They didn't need external guidance. They hunted the electromagnetic signatures emitted by Russian jammers, radiation waves that were essentially digital fingerprints. The first anti-radiation drone locked onto the Krasuka unit at 3:23 a.m. The Russian EW team sensed the threat too late. Their radar spike readings surged abnormally, indicating a fast-moving object approaching their dish array. "Shut it down," the commander yelled. But powering down an EW system wasn't like flipping a switch, it took 40 seconds to wind down safely. The drone reached them in 8. It slammed directly into the central emitter dome. A blinding white flash burst across the valley, followed by a fireball that consumed the entire truck-mounted EW array. Russian operators were thrown several meters, landing hard on frozen soil as burning fragments rained down. Moments later, a second anti-radiation drone struck the Zittel unit, turning it into a crater of twisted metal and sparking circuits. With their electronic shield collapsing, Russian radio networks fell into silent fragmentation. Command posts lost contact with artillery units. Artillery units lost contact with infantry support. Infantry support had no idea what was happening. Ukraine's ECM systems, still active, now met no resistance. The airwaves became Ukrainian territory. Operators inside the bunker saw the signal indicators go dark, one by one. The Russians were blind. The Russians were deaf. The Russians were exposed. And that was the moment Ukrainian commanders had been waiting for. At 3:26 a.m., the last phase began. The loitering munitions, sleek, deadly drones nicknamed silent meteors, lifted from their launching rails with a low, smooth roar. These were not improvisational weapons. They were precision strike units carrying powerful warheads, programmed with exact coordinates gathered over weeks of reconnaissance. Their ascent was almost ceremonial, slow, controlled, deliberate. Then, once they cleared the tree line, they accelerated sharply and streaked toward the crippled artillery line. By now, Russian soldiers were in full panic. Some attempted to extinguish burning vehicles with snow shovels and sandbags. Others dragged wounded comrades toward makeshift bunkers. Officers screamed conflicting orders, some to hold ground, some to retreat. Then they heard the sound. A long, steady hum, sharp, focused, unmistakable. The sound of loitering munitions diving. The first struck a Smerch launcher. The entire machine lifted off the ground in a mushroom of flame, then crashed back into the snow as a heap of twisted steel. A second munition obliterated a Giant howitzer, flipping it onto its side like a toy hit by a hammer. A third dove straight into an ammo transport truck already weakened by earlier blasts. The explosion triggered a chain reaction so violent it temporarily blew out the floodlights along the ridge. From a distance, the artillery line no longer looked like a fortified position. It looked like a burning scrapyard, stretching nearly 2 kilometers. In 11 minutes, Ukraine had destroyed 38 artillery systems, 10 ammunition trucks, 2 electronic warfare domes, multiple command posts, dozens of support vehicles. Total value, over $3.6 billion, gone. The swarm had done what traditional artillery couldn't, it removed an entire fortified sector without risking a single Ukrainian soldier. By 4 a.m., the battle was over. Smoke drifted across the valley like a gray curtain. Burning wreckage sizzled in the snow. The once perfect Russian artillery line was reduced to a jagged silhouette of destroyed metal. Russian soldiers wandered through the devastation in silent disbelief. Some were dragging wounded. Others stared blankly at the craters where their artillery had once stood. The pride of their defensive operation, months of work, millions of rubles in equipment, had vanished in a single coordinated strike. Satellite images released later showed the truth with brutal clarity, a 2.7 kilometer zone of total annihilation, gouged out of the forest line like a scar. Military analysts around the world reacted the same way. This wasn't just an attack. This was a demonstration of a new era of warfare. Drones had replaced artillery duels. Algorithms replaced battalion maneuvers. Machine swarms replaced infantry waves. The battlefield had changed permanently. Ukrainian officers watching the strike footage understood the larger implication. If 201 drones could erase a fortified artillery division in minutes, what could 500 drones do? What about 1,000? Russia's traditional doctrine, deep, slow, artillery-heavy warfare, was no longer viable against a swarm-based military. And as dawn broke over the shattered valley, one message echoed across the front. The drone age has begun. Whoever masters it will decide the war.